welcome everyone. I'm Vanita, and we're going to be talking today about really unlocking the potential for, shall we call that, anti-aging. So in this session, we're discussing our genetic makeup with IQ testing. So in this session, we will talk about IQ testing, really identifying DNA constructs, fine-tuning medication choices based on individual genetic makeup. This is what we call pharmacogenomics. And identifying the key methylation markers and longevity genes that play a really crucial role in the aging process. The term lifespan and health span has expanded so much. Everybody wants to live longer, but we really want to live longer, healthier. So we'll look at personalized custom health approaches based on IQ testing. So the three tests we'll discuss today is pharmacogenomics, or the PharmaQ, the methylation program, and the longevity IQ. Now, do be aware, we also have IQ, gut IQ as well, which uses shotgun sequencing. This is not what we're going to be talking about today. So in relation to Pharma IQ is in actual fact a combination of pharmacology, which is the science of drugs, as well as the science of genes, and we put that together to fine-tune a patient's prescription needs. Often a patient would use an SSRI and they find, my gosh, I feel more depressed using that particular SSRI instead of feeling happier. So this is why we would want to look at, pharmacology. Obviously, we'll identify methylation processes and also the number of years an individual lives in good health and free from chronic diseases. So the first part of the profile is pharmacology. So pharmacogenomics is what we'll discuss, and that is called Pharma IQ. So really how genetic makeup affects the response to drugs, and combining pharmacology together with genetics to identify which drug is best for a patient. So we identify it based on metabolism of these drugs. So when we think about metabolism, we are using specific enzymatic function that is associated with liver detoxification, your cytochrome P450 enzymes, various alleles of them. And based on how the drug responds in the body to its metabolic processes, we will identify, firstly, based on genetic outcome, whether the patient is an ultra-rapid metabolizer. This is somebody who takes that drug, uses it up really quickly, needs higher doses of that drug to probably achieve the same health outcome. Let's say if we have a patient who is using a codeine medication. Now, codeine obviously metabolizes and converts to morphine eventually, and that leads, if an ultra-rapid metabolizer needs higher doses of that codeine to achieve the pain effect. Whereas a poor metabolizer is somebody who's slow. It metabolizes, they only need half of a dose or a quarter of a tablet to achieve that level of pain relief. And the reason being is that the metabolism of that particular drug is so slow that it accumulates and can lead to significant side effects. So on that basis, we can identify, firstly, metabolism, whether the patient is slow metabolizer, fast metabolizer, etc. And the reporting is based predominantly on a robotic system. So red, simvastatin is red in this instance. So if that is red, it's probably not advisable for the patient to use that because they have a greater propensity, even though they're a normal metabolizer, they have a greater propensity for its side effect profile. So myalgia, myopathies, etc. Whereas rosuvastatin would suit the patient better based on their metabolism profiles. And if rosuvastatin is not available, they can definitely consider atorvastatin in this particular example. So these tests actually cover, Pharma IQ covers testing of your ADHD drugs, your antipsychotics, your antidepressants, your mood stabilizers, your hypnotics, as well as your NSAIDs, beta blockers, PPIs as well as statins. So this is Pharma IQ is really helpful for anybody that has a problem with their drugs, and you might want to consider, well, what else is happening for this patient? What is the best drug suited for my patient? The next test we'll discuss is methylation. Now, methylation is probably the most well-studied group of DNA genetics that we have studied on, and it really is associated. Methylation is really a chemical reaction that adds methyl groups to the DNA, to proteins, to lipids, really to produce our proteins that encode genes. So it affects how the gene is expressed and which is turning on, which is turning off. Of course, we know methylation is involved in the production of neurotransmitters, sex hormones, and basically balancing homocysteine to drive down inflammation. And in doing that, it is controlling. Methylation is very important. It underpins most physiological functions in the body: the immune system, cardiovascular system, detox pathways, etc. So we will discuss the various variants of MTHFR, PMT, MTI, MTIR, CBS, etc. These genes tend to require much higher amounts of vitamin B6, and that can lead to elevated homocysteine due to a higher need for their substrates, their foundational substrates. And these are folate, choline, betaine, and we'll discuss all of them as we go along. So the methylation IQ covers all of these genes that are listed on the screen. And when we talk about genes, we're really referring to its genotype, which really refers to specific genetic makeup at a location of the genome. RS number is considered to be the phenotype. So here, one gene can be expressed as a number of alleles, in other words, different types of alleles within that genotype. And the phenotype is the RS number. So if you're a geneticist, by the way, I'm not a geneticist, so if you have any purely genetic questions and I'm unable to answer them, I'm happy to get the response from our in-house geneticist. The RS number identifies the location of that genetic variation. So the phenotype is basically, it's like, let's say, an eye color. That's your phenotype. So if you have mum and dad both have blue eyes, you're likely to have blue eyes. But if your mum has blue eyes and dad has brown eyes, you might have either blue or brown eyes. And this is where we identify the actual genetic typing, right? So you could either be heterozygous, where you have two alleles. This means that they are different. They have, generally example eyes, different eyes, right? And they have, this might be a protective advantage. Homozygous, usually the patient will have two identical alleles. For example, they'll either have two blue-eyed parents, will have a blue-eyed baby, etc. And the wild type is considered to be what is normal allele for that gene that's naturally found. And of course, we identify various SNPs, and these SNPs are single oligonucleotide polymorphisms, which is a variation in the DNA sequence, which occurs, based on its reference sequencing. And of course, the nucleotides or the amino acids are guanine, adenine, cytosine, thymine. So as you can see on the right columns, GG would refer to guanine. So where exactly, which amino acids in that DNA strain are we actually identifying and talking about, right? I'm sure as practitioners, you would be very, very familiar with the folate pathway or the methylation pathway. And just as a brief refresher, our diet consists, all our green leafy vegetables consists of, or is made up of a decent amount of folate. And we need that folate to actually feed into both the folate pathway, which is the pathway on the left, the methionine or SAMe pathway, which is the pathway on the right, the glutathione pathway, or transsulfuration pathway, which is the pathway down the bottom. And then, of course, there are various other agents as well, other mechanisms such as COMT and PMT, and we'll discuss each of these major methylation genetics. This is the methylation IQ is actually probably the most comprehensive gene methylation profile because it covers all the various enzymatic reactions. So as you can see at the top of the screen, your folate needs to be metabolized in the liver by a dihydrofolate reductase, DHFR, into dihydrofolate, then tetrahydrofolate, and then it feeds into, with the help of vitamin B6, feeds into your 5,10 methylfolate, so it's starting to become methylated, and then we use the MTHFR enzymatic function. So MTHFR is something, methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase is probably the most important regulator within the folate cycle to feed into what we call the methionine or the SAMe pathway. So really homocysteine is recycled into your folate pathway as well as the methionine pathway. So let's go through each of these constructs within the methylation pathway. So the first pathway we're talking about is MTHFR. This is part of our folate cycle. MTR and MTRR is your methionine cycle. The folic acid supplementation is driven predominantly by DHFR and MTHFD1. Then we have the transsulfuration pathway, which is driven by CBS, and then the methyltransferase, which is COMT, as well as PMT. Now, these enzymes are very important because you can then identify exactly where things are going out of whack in the actual pathway. So the report looks a little bit like that, where you can actually see MTHFR and where the gene marker is expressed as paying attention in terms of high priority, medium or low priority, and the text on the right usually gives us a little bit more information about the actual gene. So we would typically see if there's a high priority for MTHFR, there's a likelihood of greater inflammation and there's a metabolic block. You're likely to see high levels of homocysteine, which leads to inflammation, infertility, all sorts of issues there. MTHFR, C677T gene is in terms of levels of defect, methylation defect, MTHFR homozygous for the C677T gene is considered to be most effective. Then it's the compound heterozygous and etc. So a heterozygous and homozygous is really giving you the degree of methylation defects. So you need, if your patient is heterozygous for the MTHFR gene, this is C677T, they're likely to lose about 30% of their methylation capacity. And they will need those cofactors, possibly a lower dose longer term, such as riboflavin, your methylfolate, your tetrahydrobiopterin, and your B group vitamins, as well as CoQ10, because they all are involved in the production of our neurotransmitters. And be aware that if a patient is using PPIs or OCP, oral contraceptives, NSAIDs, or anticonvulsants, these agents tend to block MTHFR gene function. So we identify both the A1298C as well as the C677T. So you can definitely, the report is quite conclusive. Now, in relation to MTHFR, which basically stands for methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. So it's a reduction of your 5,10 methylfolate into 5-methylfolate tetrahydrofolate. So the RS number, that 1801131, pertains specifically to the A1298C gene. So folate does not affect, if it is not effectively converting your 5-MTHF into its metabolites. So it generally, if you have a 1298C gene that's heterozygous, you'll find that there's a lower level of methylation defect in comparison to that of a C677T gene, which is the RS 1801133. The combination of the two SNPs, which is compound heterozygous, can result in up to 40% reduction in MTHFR function. So, the major difference from a genetic perspective is that the C677T gene is basically substituting alanine for valine in the DNA strand, and the 1298 is substituting alanine for glutamine. So your amino acids play such a vital role in changing the expression of these genes. So if you do have MTHFR mutation, hetero or homozygous, you need to ensure that the patient is taking folate in a bioavailable form. So methylfolate, folinic acid, you'll need to actually consider using those agents, all right? Now let's have a look at dihydrofolate reductase. This actually catalyzes the reduction of dihydrofolate. Remember what we said? Folate in the terms of food is broken down into dihydrofolate and then tetrahydrofolate, and this is all happening in the liver, all right? So that impacts the breakdown of synthetic folic acid and basically bringing it into the start of the cycle. So if your patient has variants in MTHFR, MTHFD1, and DHFR, then there may be an increased chance of synthetic folate accumulating and bottlenecking to form and reducing those enzymatic functions, blocking your folic acid receptors, and that leads to elevations of metabolized folic acid. And if that is the case, then one needs to think about supplementing with a methylated folic acid, right? So down the bottom, we can see that DHFR converts your folic acid from your food into dihydrofolate and tetrahydrofolate. MTHFD1 is actually activating it to 510 MTHF and then MTHFR obviously into its activated forms. Now the next marker we look at is MTHFD1. This is the pathway that converts tetrahydrofolate into 510 methyl tetrahydrofolate. Generally, we would see that there's a reduced MTHFD1 activity with low folate or low choline, which may increase the risk for the genome. So if you have low choline, choline is actually one of the major amino acids that are involved not only in the production of acetylcholine for regulation of BPs, etc., but also for cognition, memory, focus, attention. So this is actually very important, all right? This is why we would use a phosphorylated version of choline like phosphatidylserine, phosphatidylcholine, and so forth. So yes, so essentially we may need to think about be aware of unmetabolized folic acid accumulation and used folic acid in its methylated form. So methionine synthase is the next, or MTR, which is methionine synthase. It actually is involved in conversion of your folate into methionine. All we need to do is we need to make sure that the MTR, both MTR and MTRR work together in converting homocysteine to methionine and a folate 5-MTHF into methionine. And that's basically feeding into the folate pathway as well as the SAMe pathway, right? So low MTR function reduces the methionine. Methionine is really, I guess, derived predominantly from protein sources. So this is why we need our protein to generate methionine and SAMe. So that's your piece of steak. And we also need folate in the form of leafy green vegetables. So your steak with leafy green vegetables will be really great in order to ensure that your body is utilizing these cofactors rather than that donut that we tend to head towards. So low MTR function reduces methionine and subsequent, obviously, SAMe levels. And of course, the microbiome composition also impacts how we use these methylating cofactors and affects other neurotransmitter functions, exactly like GABA conversion to GABA, glutamate to GABA, etc. So the MTR gene codes for the conversion of homocysteine to methionine. And we need your cofactors such as zinc, your B12, and folic acid as well. MTRR is methionine synthase reductase. So this is the reduction of methionine. So it works together with MTR to convert homocysteine to methionine, and the cofactors are basically B12 and riboflavin. So we do send a reduced MTR activity can tend to increase your homocysteine levels. If no mutation is found in MTR, then MTRR variants are less pronounced. So we will see that we have an increased risk for various issues of variants such as MTR and MTRR leads to generally B12 deficiency. So always think about methylcobalamin. Now the next pathway is the cystathine pathway, and this is homocysteine to glutathione conversion, and this is happening predominantly in the liver because this is part of the transsulfuration pathway. So cystathine beta synthase is in actual fact a transsulfuration pathway which directs homocysteine away from the methionine synthesis and converts it into glutathione. It requires vitamin B6, it requires SAMe as modulators. Any mutation that's linked to higher or lower levels of homocysteine can reduce that cystathine and the betaine levels. So we may need to think about ensuring that there's a healthy amount of homocysteine, healthy amount of SAMe, B6, and these will help mitigate the risk of selenium buildup. Cystathine needs selenium. So we need B6 and SAMe as cofactors for CBS pathway, but we also ensure that cofactors or trace elements such as selenium are present as well. Now we're talking about the methyltransferases. These are enzymes that are involved not only in enzymatic conversion of dopamine and your catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, but also your estrogens as well, your catechol estrogens. Once the estrogens are metabolized in the liver by your cytochrome enzymes, in other words, they're hydroxylated, they then need to be methylated in its metabolism out of the body. And the methylation is done by catechol methyltransferase. So you'll find that typically if there's a genetic mutation in COMT, you're likely to see a reduced level of dopamine and serotonin levels, as well as reduced estrogen clearance, in other words, estrogen dominance as well. So this is where we might consider agents such as your methylating cofactors, vitamin C, a decent amount of copper as well. Now, PEMT, which is another methyltransferase enzyme, is in actual fact called phosphatidylethanolamin and methyltransferase. And as you can see, it is actually involved in the conversion of phosphatidylcholine into choline and betaine. So it's involved in the synthesis of choline. PMT is regulated by estrogen. So, and the reduced ability, when you have a PMT mutation, you're likely to have a reduced ability to generate choline. And this is where you might need to consider choline as a supplement. Your phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylserine, even a handful of lecithin in your cereal would be really valuable as well. So if we have a look at the methylation genes, we can actually see that all the genes require specific nutrients. PMT, we need choline, betaine, vitamin C, MTHFD1, we need folic acid, folinic acid. I ideally always use methylated versions of these nutrients together with choline and so forth. But we need to be mindful of the fact that PMT mutations can be, the activity of that enzymatic function can be depleted by drugs such as antihistamines and antidepressants. So we need to be mindful, if your patient is taking various medications, we need to be mindful that that in itself will impact genetic function or the enzymatic function, which then implies that you as a practitioner need to think about, well, what are the modifying factors that can play a role and what are the nutrient factors can change the expression of those various genes. Now, the next test we're going to discuss today is the longevity IQ. Longevity IQ is in actual fact a compilation of some really profound genes that will give us an indication of, how a patient is living their life. We don't want to live forever. We want to live healthily forever. So we want to improve our health span and our lifespan. So the main roots of our longevity IQ is really going through what causes inflammation, right? We're looking at antioxidant systems. We're looking at physical training. We're looking at pancreatic function, etc. So we are in what we call a longevity boom. Everybody's talking about living longer, but the sting in the tail of the longevity boom is we don't want more years of being ill. We want more years of being really healthy. So, life expectancy, when we talk about life expectancy, we talk, for example, the life expectancy of a comedian is about 30 seconds. If you haven't hooked them on in 30 seconds, then, you're pretty dead as a comedian. So this is what we want in our genetic profiling, identifying the markers of inflammation, of cardiovascular function, and really to prevent any forms of degradation, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's cancers, etc. So these are the genes that we're actually identifying in the panel, and each of the panel or the report consists of discussing each of these genes in this fashion. So example is ApoE. Now ApoE provides instructions for making proteins that move your cholesterol and fats through the bloodstream. Apo, of course, we know there's a number of alleles, Apo2, 3, 4. ApoE4 is associated, and there are different genetic alleles associated with that. ApoE4 is associated predominantly with the higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, whereas ApoE2 and 3 are usually associated with lipid dysfunction. So we need to be mindful and very important to read up about each of these genes. So let's have a look at the first one, which is ApoE. We will have a look at ACTM3, SOD superoxide dismutase and catalase, LPA. Then we have obviously COMT. We've got GTSM1, your MTHFR. So look, these are all the genes that are covered within the longevity profile, NP21, and we'll discuss each of these genes in detail. Now, the genes such as COMT, MTHFR, PMT, and CBS, we've already discussed because they were found in our methylation profile. So those are included in the longevity IQ as well. So let's go through each of these genes. ApoE. ApoE is probably the most important longevity gene because it affects our lipid profiling, lipid metabolism. ApoE is basically one ApoE GE4 gene, basically doubles or triples the risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. So, it's very important to actually identify these APO genes. ApoE polymorphisms have an influence, obviously, on lipid responses and lipid binding protein that transports your triglycerides and cholesterol in the tissues, including the brain. So you get a better longevity with ApoE2 and 3 and a reduced longevity with ApoE4. So ideally, you'd want to make sure that if a patient has an ApoE mutation, you might want to incorporate anti-inflammatory agents such as omega-3 DHAs to slow that development of dementia or Alzheimer's. FOXO2 is essentially probably the most master regulator of oxidative stress and oxidative damage. So we see an increased expression of superoxide dismutase and catalase that maintain your stem cell pool. It boosts and lowers the stress resistance, influences insulin sensitivity, and modulates the DNA damage. So you'll find FOX stands for your transcription factor forkhead O3, and this particular gene plays a very pivotal role in longevity by protecting against type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, neurological diseases, etc. So it is very important to actually look into this particular marker. The FOX as well, the various alleles, tend to help identify responders versus non-responders to conventional therapies. calorie restriction to dietary supplementation. So you might need to use high levels of antioxidants in patients that have this particular gene expression. So inflammation is predominantly associated with cardiovascular disease, your diabetes, your chronic diseases, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and all your autoimmune diseases. Never before have autoimmune diseases been that fashionable. There's so many people with all sorts of inflammatory conditions. ApoE affects infection risks. It supports your LDL dietary responses and also helps with cognition health as well. FOXO3 is, as we know, is a gatekeeper for oxidative stress. It's probably the most important marker for oxidative damage and oxidative stress because it protects against the heart and blood vessels and regulates autophagy. It's involved in proliferation. It's also involved in cell survival and cardiac cells. In relation to cancer, lung cancer is probably the most commonly occurring cancer worldwide today, as we stand today, followed by breast cancer, colorectal cancer, etc. And low levels of FOX protein expression is usually associated with a very poor prognosis of lung cancer, breast cancer, and all the various other cancers. Your BRCA1 and your FOXO3 are considered the two core tumor suppressors in breast cancer. So it's important to have a look at those two markers as well. So it identifies, it basically suggests that agents that activate FOXO3 can be novel therapeutic agents that can inhibit and prevent tumor proliferation. So we're talking about your newer immunotherapies that are out on the market, but also natural therapies, agents such as cherry extract, blueberry extract, chrysin, genicin, olive oil, berberines, astaxanthins, the NAD, PQQ. These are all agents that work at stimulating FOXO3 enzymatic function. Now, ApoE4, as we mentioned earlier, it actually doubles or triples the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Having two E4 alleles, 4 increases the risk 8 to 12-fold. So it's highly responsive to diet and environmental strategies. ApoE4 increases the sensitivity to oxidative stress. So if we have a looking at these gene markers, FOXO3, glutathione, catalase, SOD, PMT, methylation SNPs, etc., these all assist in comprehensive patient plan to address all the potential ways to reduce the risk of chronic diseases, including dementia. Your type 2 diabetes, as well known, it's so inflammatory. Diabesity is a thing now. It's a condition of obesity and diabetes together. That increases the risk of cardiovascular diseases and cancers. And so your genes such as FOXO3, TCF7L2, and NP21, these are associated with type 2 diabetes. So we will discuss these in a bit more detail. And when we're looking into those ones, let's have a look at the first one, which is ACTN3. Now, this is a marker for athletic performance. It stands for alpha-actinin 3, which has a role in muscle contraction. It's linked to a decreased risk of injuries. The CCT genotype is associated with muscle strength. CT is associated with exercise recovery, and the TT genotype is associated with muscle fiber expression. So you would need to then consider CC stands for cytosine, CT, cytosine, thymine, etc. So that's exactly where it is in the DNA strand. GSTM1 is a glutathione transferase that plays a role in the detoxification of your carcinogens, environmental toxins, and all of those sorts of things as well. So this is very important that it's a glutathionation pathway that is affected here. And And it's, once again, if you have a look, the recommendations are lots of antioxidants, vitamin A, C, E, zinc, resveratrol, a lot of the cruciferous vegetables, sulforaphanes. These are all going to support that whole pathway to actually drive down the benzpyrenes and nitric dioxides accumulation. GSTP1 stands for glutathione S-transferase P1. Again, it's needed in the phase 2 glutathionation detoxification pathway. And their activity is dependent entirely on the availability of glutathione. See how important those amino acids are? So we therefore need your antioxidants to support that pathway. We're talking about curcumin, quercetin. These are very, very powerful, all your polyphenols, very powerful to induce the expression of GTSP1, obviously your cruciferous vegetables as well. Superoxide dismutase, SOD2, this is dependent on manganese. Manganese actually protects against the superoxide. We need very trace amounts of manganese to make things work. So variant allele carriers have a really high sensitivity to glyphosates, fluoridated waters, chronic stress, poor sleep, and shallow breathing as well. Once again, SOD, besides being manganese dependent, it is ideal always when you have your GTS, your SOD, your catalase, your acetylase, all of those enzymatic functions, and if there are any mutations found in those particular gene constructs, it's a good idea for you to consider some form of detoxification of the liver. All right, usually with an infrared sauna profile, etc., and binders, and you can create your own profile to actually work very well at regulating the function of the liver, and then start supplementing with your antioxidants such as lycopene, vitamin C, and these all support the allele carriers. Catalase, CAT, is dependent on zinc and copper. And that is really very important for superoxide dismutase to function together with catalase within the cell membrane. You'll find that it can lead to higher sensitivities to oxidative stress and increased DNA damage. So variant allele carriers might have an increased sensitivity to BPA plastics as well. So, and that obviously is an endocrine disruptor, so it affects your hormone metabolism. So the recommendations, once again, is antioxidant support, your flavonoids, selenium, ginger, curcumin, and your spices such as caraway and fennel. These are all agents that can support catalase function. So just getting your patient to have a tea with a bit of all of these spices would be very helpful for them on a day-to-day basis. GPX1 is a glutathione peroxidase gene, and that codes for a selenium-dependent antioxidant enzyme. That actually helps prevent oxidative damage to the cells. So GPX is probably the most abundant form of glutathione peroxidase, and the risk allele is linked to a lower antioxidant protection and a higher need for selenium. So take your Brazil nuts and various foods that are rich in selenium as well. A handful of those nuts on a daily basis would be valuable, not only for GPX1, but also thyroid function as well. So again, once again, your antioxidant support such as selenium, cold exposure, stimulating the vagus nerve, vitamin C, niacin, milk thistle, ginger, etc. These are all agents that can support this GPX1. NBPF3. This is a gene that is a best indicator for B6 levels. Now we know xanthurenic acid in an organic acid profile gives you an indication of the utilization of that vitamin B6, and it's probably the greatest surrogate marker in a urine sample to identify B6 deficiencies, whereas NBFP3 is NBPF3 is in actual fact the best indicator for baseline B6 levels. So variant carriers tend to have a lower levels of vitamin B6 blood concentrations. It's involved, B6 is involved in manufacture and the synthesis of serotonin in brain development. It's implicated in the development of neuroblastomas and solid tumors. Your B6 is crucial for the development of the fetus brain as well as the nervous system. And we'll find that there's an increased need for B6, particularly during pregnancy and lactation. So B6 in its various forms can be very valuable if you have a mutation in the NBPF3, quite a mouthful. FUT2, this is a gene that basically is what we call a secretor gene. It's crucial for the role in determining your secretor status. So a secretor is basically somebody who secretes blood type antigens into the body fluids, like your saliva, your tears, your sweat, your breast milk, your semen. People who are secretors, about 80% of the population tend to be secretors. The non-secretors are the ones that don't secrete very little antigens into the body fluids, and they tend to be more prone, the non-secretors are more prone to inflammation and infections, etc. So the status is really important to influence the presence of your ABO blood types. And the importance of your microbiota is so important because bifidobacterium is responsible for GABA and folate production. So non-secretor genotypes are associated with a lower bifidobacterium in the gut and therefore abundance of bacterial genotypes. So patients who have a FUT2 genotype not only need a bit of B12 long term, but they also need their microbiome, a more robust, more diverse microbiome to ensure that there is a reduction in that level of inflammation. So prebiotics in the form of food, such as bananas, garlics, leeks, etc., can be very useful, or your arabinogalactones, lactoferrins, lactoalbumin, slippery elm, marshmallow, all of those sorts of prebiotics can be very useful as well, together with vitamin B12. LPA is probably a major marker of the cardiovascular system, and it provides instructions for making proteins called apolipoproteins, and this protein is a component of lipoprotein A, which is really a marker of familial hypercholesteremia. So genetic variants predispose patients to higher risks of heart disease and of course strokes as well. So LPA genotypes you need to stimulate a healthy heart function. So low cholesterol diets are really healthy, lots of exercise, avoid any stimulants, smoking, alcohol, etc. And using cholesterol lowering strategies, your bergamettes, your activated B3s, etc. NP21 is considered probably the most important genetic marker for cardiovascular health. So your diets that are low in fruits and vegetables tend to be implicated in mutations associated with NP21. It's associated with a twofold increased risk of cardiovascular issues and up to twofold increase in cardiovascular disease. So heart attacks, cardiovascular diseases, etc. Once again, a low cholesterol diet, higher fruits, vegetable intake for a healthy heart. TCF7L2 is the gene that encodes predominantly for body mass index and triglycerides. So it's the strongest indicator for type 2 diabetes and gestational diabetes risk. And you'll find that it's associated with low incretin hormones. Incretin hormones, the GLP-1 agonists, for example, your Ozempics, are part and parcel of the incretin hormones that impairs insulin secretion. So the recommendations in this instance, if you have a mutation found in a TCF7L2, definitely consider an anti-diabetic diet. All right. So here we're talking about increasing your incretins. Your oats agents, for example, are really good. Polyphenols, caffeine, cocoa, these are really useful agents. Lots of polyphenols, prebiotics. We need to stimulate the incretins with glycine, omega-3, turmeric, cinnamon, organic dark chocolates, coffees, cordyceps. These are agents that can be very useful in terms of supporting that pathway. So longevity genetics, of course, we've just skimmed through all of these gene markers. There's a lot more to be said about them. So it is very important to understand what these gene markers do and where they fit into the health span longevity. So MTHFR, as we well know, needs your vitamin B6 and B9, which is your methylfolate. PMT, MTHFR, MTR needs choline, and of course all the other markers as well. We need B12 and zinc and so forth. And we also find that we need B2 for both MTHFR as well as MTR. For your FUT2 genes, your CBS pathways, we need your B12. We also need SAMI, we need B6, etc. GTSP1, we need vitamin E, and so forth. And B6, of course, the good old favorite. So, of course, there are many more nutrients that we can consider, but this test, the longevity IQ, gives us a really deep insight into metabolic blocks that can be associated with inflammation and the propensity for risk of various diseases. Now that concludes our session today.
Welcome to Rupa Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.